Hello, this is an overview of American literature. You know that English literature is not only the literature of the UK, it is also the literature of America, Europe, post-colonial countries, etc. The American continent was discovered by Christopher Columbus when he landed in the Bahamas Island in 1492. This came to be called the New World. American literature is primarily beginning in the 16th and 17th centuries. It is the literature of the settlers, the travelers, the explorers, the refugees who came to the New World from Britain. America started with 13 colonies in the eastern side of the continent, in the Atlantic coast. And eventually, these 13 colonies that were established expanded. The American continent had its earliest settlements in the east. There was wilderness or forest area in the west. The imaginary line separating the eastern settlements with the western forests, the region of the Red Indians, that imaginary line separating the east and the west, that is called the frontier. Sometime in the 19th century, Frederick Jackson Turner put forth the frontier thesis, which means that the development of America is analogous to the recession of the frontier to the west. If you did not understand, I will explain. Imagine that this is the American continent. On this side you have the Atlantic Ocean. On this side we have the Pacific Ocean. The earliest settlements in America started in the eastern coast. And there is an imaginary line that separates the eastern settlements with the western forest area. This imaginary line recedes to the west as the white settlements grow. This recession of the frontier is analogous to the development of America. Now there is no frontier. The frontier is here in the Pacific Ocean or in the Pacific coast. So America is about the first original inhabitants, or what is called the Red Indians. It is about the white settlers. It is also about the immigrants from Africa and Asia in later times. The Africans were not immigrants, they were originally brought as slaves during the period of the Atlantic slave trade. So America is a completely multicultural continent, a multicultural society. The earliest brilliant period of American literature is indeed the period of American Revolutionary War and independence. That is in the second half of the 18th century, the period of great Americans like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, etc. Benjamin Franklin was a politician, a scientist, a writer. He wrote the Busybody Papers. Thomas Paine, who came to America because of the suggestion of Benjamin Franklin, is said to have begun the American Revolution with his pamphlet Common Sense, published in 1775. The very next year came the Declaration of Independence. This is also the time of the earliest slave writers like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, Harriet Wilson, etc. And after the American independence, in the 19th century, you can see two brilliant writers, Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper. Washington Irving wrote under the pen name Jeffrey Crayon, and is the father of American short story, having written famous short stories in his sketchbook, such as Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. James Fenimore Cooper is the author of The Leather-Stocking Tales, a group of 5 tales featuring the character Nathaniel Bumppo or Natty Bumppo. He's a white man who lives among the natives, like Tarzan. During this time, in America, there is a cowboy culture, especially in the southern states like Texas. And there is a lot of literature associated with the American prairies. Cowboy culture and American prairies is also related to the frontier, the meeting point of white culture and native culture. The 19th century in American literature is the period of Romanticism. This is the time when British Romantics influenced Americans, and the Americans began to talk about nature, subjective emotions, supernaturalism. In American Romanticism, there is a new variety called dark Romanticism. And the 19th century witnessed the emergence of what is called American Dream. Americans believe in success. If you do hard work and go beyond the frontier, go into the forest where everybody is equal, where you have freedom, where you can do hard work, there you can get success. That is the American dream. The 19th century Romantic period in America also witnessed the formation of an American spirit, American identity, especially in the hands of writers like the transcendentalists. The American dream was inspired by the frontier. It was also inspired by something that happened in the 1840s. Do you know what that is? Something was discovered in California in the West. What is that? Gold. The gold rush, the California gold rush, happened in the 1840s. Gold nuggets were first discovered on a river bank. And lots of people from across America and even from Europe started to pour into California in search of gold. We can get rich. We can be successful. We will be on the top of the world. The American dream flourished because of the gold rush. It ended in the 1850s. But it gave Americans a lot of confidence, hope, optimism, which defined American identity, American national consciousness. Now, associated with the frontier, associated with the American dream also, is the concept of the wild, wild West. You must have seen in Hollywood movies representations of the West, the American West. The Westerns is a genre in Hollywood as well as in American literature that represented the Wild West. So many American characters are there, like Biff in Death of a Salesman, Huckleberry Finn, etc., who just wanted to go to the West and get rich there. That is the representation of the American dream. As I told you, in the 19th century American literature, there is dark romanticism, representations of the dark recesses of the human mind, dark passions. As in Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, as in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, as in the Gothic romances of Edgar Allan Poe. Some of these characters have gigantic passions, like Captain Ahab in Moby Dick. They are evil, like the heroes in many stories by Edgar Allan Poe. They have inscrutable, unfathomable passions. Deep discussions of morality, as in Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. Now at this time, people like Nathaniel Hawthorne was harking back on something that happened in the 17th century, the Salem witch trials. Many women and even children were tried and punished for being witches. There was a religious fervor. You know why? Because the earliest settlements of America, especially in New England, were those of Puritans. Puritanical religion, Calvinism, Quaker religion, etc., held sway over the American society at this time. Very strict moralists they were, against which Americans rebelled in subsequent periods. So, dark romanticism has its roots in religion. Other romantic movements of the 19th century in America also show deep concerns related to religion, deep preoccupation with religion, as transcendentalism or the poetry of Emily Dickinson. The transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau were associated with Unitarian religion, which Emerson rejected, and they advocated a kind of international religious spirituality, being inspired by Eastern spirituality pertaining to Zen Buddhism, Indian philosophy, and so on. Confucianism. The Transcendentalists advocated the idea of an oversoul, which is like Paramatma. The Transcendentalists advocated direct learning from nature. They repudiated the influence of the Europeans, and they advocated an Americanness in culture, life, and writing. Associated with Emerson and Thoreau was Walt Whitman, a great advocate of individualism and democracy. In the poems of his most important and only published work, Leaves of Grass, Emily Dickinson wrote with mysticism about death, immortality, and the traumas of existence. The 1850s in American literature is the period of American Renaissance. A flowering of American literature happened at this time. Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, Melville's Moby Dick, Emerson's Representative Men, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass were all published in the 1850s. There was at this time a movement against slavery. The American continent, or the United States of America, was divided into the northern states and the southern states. The northern states had industries, while the southern states had plantations. The aristocratic families, the rich aristocratic families of the American South, practiced slavery in their plantations, against which the northern states and the Republicans, led by Abraham Lincoln, led the American Civil War. The Civil War started in 1861, right after Abraham Lincoln became the president, and ended in 1865 with the assassination of Lincoln, about which event Walt Whitman has written heart-rending elegies. The Civil War ended and marked the end of slavery and the beginning of realism in American literature. The greatest figure during the period of realism is Mark Twain. Mark Twain, who wrote one of the pillars of American literature, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Mark Twain was a local color realist who wrote about the region of Mississippi. Mark Twain was certainly not the only writer to write about Mississippi. William Faulkner and other later writers have also brought Mississippi alive in literature. The period of realism led to the period or the movement of naturalism. Naturalism is a scientific depiction of human beings as products of their environment. The philosophy of naturalism shows that human beings are products of their environment. People become outcasts or criminals or prostitutes, for example, because of their circumstances. We have very brilliant novels of the naturalist kind, such as Jack London's The Call of the Wild, Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy, Sister Carrie, and so on. In this period, the early 20th century it is now, we have the first Nobel laureate, Sinclair Lewis, the first American Nobel laureate. The first novel to win the Pulitzer Prize was The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. During this time, as a reaction against the First World War and its disastrous consequences, we have the lost generation. Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, E. E. Cummings, John Dos Passos, very important writers of the lost generation. The term was applied to them by Gertrude Stein. Ernest Hemingway has written Very famous novels like The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls. These novels are largely based on his own experiences and also show the Hemingway hero who can be destroyed but not defeated. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote a great, brilliant novel, The Great Gatsby, reflecting the culture of the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties is also called the Jazz Age. And during this time, there flourished in New York, in the place called Harlem, the Harlem Renaissance, a flowering of African American literature, a new pride in being African American against white stereotypes, in authors like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, Jean Toomer, and so on. A very important writer of the early 20th century who introduced realism in American drama, who experimented with expressionism, who for the first time introduced African American characters and their dialect on American stage. You might have guessed it. It is Eugene O'Neill, who wrote brilliant plays like The Morning Becomes Electra and Desire Under the Ems, Iceman Cometh, Hairy Ape, Emperor Jones, Long Day's Journey into Night, and so on and so forth. He revolutionized drama in many ways. And then in the 1930s, there is the period of the Great Depression. The stock market crash in 1929 led to the failure of the American dream. A lot of writers began to express the traumas of the ordinary people who lost their jobs, who plunged into poverty, into disorientation, drug taking, depression, drinking, and suicide. Arthur Miller wrote Death of a Salesman, which is a classic expression of the period of the Great Depression. So are Tennessee Williams's plays, such as The Glass Menagerie or A Streetcar Named Desire. During this time, we also have novelists like William Faulkner, John Steinbeck. They also reflected the traumas of the Great Depression. John Steinbeck also wrote about the dust storms in Oklahoma region of this time, which is called Dust Bowl. John Steinbeck wrote Dust Bowl trilogy. These writers, Arthur Miller, William Faulkner, etc., were also modernists. In their hands, American modernism developed. The critique of the dehumanization and fragmentation of the metropolises, the disorientation of modern characters, modern people, as reflected in Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, for example, set in Yoknapatawpha County. The fictional plays where Faulkner set all his novels. This is also the time when some writers were reflecting the absurdity of the human condition, like in Edward Albee's Zoo's Story or Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, or writers were reflecting socialistic concerns. Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller had socialistic concerns in their place. Arthur Miller was even brought before the Inquisition, the HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities. It was like the Inquisition. And Clifford Odets wrote an agitprop play, Waiting for Lefty, during this time. Modernism in America is associated with the movement of imagism, a movement in poetry, as you know, led by Ezra Pound, Amy Lowell, Hilda Doolittle or H.D., Richard Aldington, etc., who were all inspired by T.E. Hume. A very major writer, a poet of the first half of the 20th century is Robert Frost, who has been called the national poet of America at that time, who won 4 Pulitzer Prizes like Eugene O'Neill in drama. And then we have the Second World War, which changed American history and inaugurated the post-war period in American literature. The post-war period in American literature saw the rise of brilliant writers like the Beat Generation writers. The Beat Generation, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs, they reacted against capitalism, against sexual conservatism, against America's involvement in the Vietnam War. They advocated freedom in society and writing in brilliant ways. Allen Ginsberg's Howl, Jack Kerouac's On the Road, William S. Burroughs' Naked Lunch are all extremely popular Beat Generation works. The Beat Generation led to the counterculture movements of the 1960s. The 1960s was a period of great cultural and social upheavals in American culture and history, as well as in Europe. It was a time of student movements, working class movements, great experimentation in literature and culture in so many ways, the coming of television and mediation of reality. This is also the time of the confessional poets like Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, and Adrienne Rich. They wrote about taboo topics like mental disease or sexuality in very unconventional ways. The 1950s and 60s is also the time of the Jewish American writers. The Jews were brilliant leaders in various aspects of culture at this time. And we have amazing writers like Saul Bellow, Bernard Malamud, Philip Roth, etc., beginning to write in the 50s and 60s. Saul Bellow's Humboldt's Gift, Herzog, Mr. Samler's Planet, Henderson the Rain King, Dangling Man, etc. are very famous. The 60s also witnessed the rise of the postmodern writers. Many postmodern writers at this time reflected a rebellious youth culture, advocated freedom, criticized the establishment, like Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, and so on. Important postmodern writers include John Barth, Donald Barthelme, and the faction writers, Norman Mailer and Truman Capote. You will wonder, what is faction? Faction is fact plus fiction. Taking facts and deliberately fictionalizing it, as Norman Mailer did in his novels like The Naked and the Dead, The Executioner's Song, The Armies of the Night, etc. Truman Capote did it in Cold Blood. He took a real murder story. 4 members of a Kansas farming family were murdered in their home. Truman Capote wrote about this actual incident in a fictional manner, looking at the story from not only the victim's point of view, but also from the murderer's point of view. Truman Capote is also remembered for Breakfast at Tiffanys, which presents an archetypal American woman as the protagonist, Holly Golightly. The novel has been turned into a memorable movie, an amazing movie, made memorable by the performance of Audrey Hepburn. You should watch it. Other postmodern writers of this time are Kurt Vonnegut, who wrote a famous anti-war novel, Slaughterhouse 5. Slaughterhouse 5, where a group of soldiers are taking refuge in a meat locker. This meat locker is metaphoric of America, of the world, where people are being butchered in the Second World War. Another heart-rending picture of the war you can get in Joseph Heller's Catch-22, where you see a group of pilots all desperate for the war to end. They are desperate to go back home. They feel that they are going crazy. But all that they can do is to wait for the war to end and save themselves from dying so that they can go back home to their families. Then there is Thomas Pynchon, the author of Gravity's Rainbow, V, The Crying of Lot 49. An amazing writer, but he writes in a very esoteric, difficult style. Then within postmodernism, there are the cyberpunk writers, Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Robert A. Heinlein, William Gibson. Science fiction that led to cyberpunk fiction, another genre. And the very popular writer Stephen King. Stephen King, whose novels have been turned into movies. You might have watched them. The Shining, It, very popular movies. So many genres emerged in the postmodern period, not only cyberpunk fiction. And American literature took the digital form at this time, novels being turned more and more into movies. There was also from the 1960s a flowering of African American literature once again in the Black Power movement, Black Arts movement, and many brilliant writers emerged in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Like Richard Wright, who wrote Native Son, Ralph Ellison, who wrote Invisible Man, James Baldwin, who wrote Go Tell It on the Mountain. And the most important writers who established African American literature as an institution, as a genre in itself, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, Lorraine Hansberry, Amiri Baraka. All of you must have heard of or read Toni Morrison's novels. Please read them. The Bluest Eye, starting from The Bluest Eye, Sula. Some of them have Gothic elements like Beloved, Song of Solomon. Later novels like Jaws, Paradise. All brilliant expositions of African American life and trauma and identity. Alice Walker is associated with womanism, a version of black feminism. Maya Angelou is famous for her autobiographical writing. She has written not one but many autobiographies, starting from I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And Amiri Baraka has revolutionized black writing with the Black Power movement and plays like Dutchman. American literature is also about the diasporic writers and also the native writers. Our own Jhumpa Lahiri or Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni are diasporic American writers. So many writers from across the world. And also Native American writers like Thomas King, Leslie Marmon Silko. They have been reclaiming their past, their identity in different ways in recent times. American literature, a discussion of American literature cannot be complete without mention to the cybernetic age, to the Hollywood movies, to the video games and web series that have revolutionized our entertainment industry as well as self-expression and identity. American literature has taken over the world in that sense. All of us are consumers of the American media. Today, when we talk about this late aspect of American literature, you cannot avoid talking about late capitalism, globalization, technocracy, neo-imperialism, and the rule of corporations. There is a lot of neo-imperialism that is at work in American media, but it is also simultaneously the site of rebellion and hope. So that is a brief overview of American literature. I hope you will read these authors and works. Pursue your own research into American literature because it is a treasure trove of experiences and perspectives and research topics as well. So with that, we come to the end of this video. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.